History doesn't always unfold through careful planning or military genius. Sometimes the fate of entire civilizations hangs by the thinnest thread of chance. Imagine a world where Persia conquered Greece centuries before Alexander, where Mongol hordes overran Japan, where Rome fell not in 476 but in 410. These aren't just alternate histories, they nearly became reality, saved only by unpredictable twists of fate that defied all human calculations. Today we're counting down 25 astonishing moments when ancient nations escaped destruction through pure, unbelievable luck, from divine storms that sank entire fleets to plagues that arrived just in time, from misinterpreted omens to freak weather events that changed the course of history. You'll hear how a single sandstorm preserved Egyptian independence for generations, how two typhoons earned the name Divine Wind in Japanese lore, and how a rainy day in ancient Athens allowed Western civilization as we know it to survive. These stories reveal history's hidden truth. Sometimes the greatest powers weren't armies or emperors, but the unpredictable hand of fortune itself. Stay with us as we uncover these narrow escapes that shaped our world, counting down from the dramatic Persian naval disaster at Mount Athos to the volcanic eruption that shielded Korea from invasion, each more improbable than the last. By the end, you'll never look at history's pivotal moments the same way again. Now let us journey back to a moment when the Aegean Sea itself rose up as Greece's unlikely defender. In the year 492 before the Common Era, King Darius I of Persia launched what should have been an unstoppable invasion force toward Greece. His massive armada, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers across 600 ships, represented the terrifying might of the Persian Empire at its peak. This was no mere raid, it was a full-scale conquest aimed at bringing the proud Greek city-states under Persian rule decades before the famous battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. As the fleet rounded the treacherous cape of Mount Athos, something extraordinary happened. Without warning, a storm of unprecedented fury descended upon the Persian ships. Ancient historians described waves taller than temples and winds that snapped masts like twigs. The sea became a churning nightmare, smashing vessel after vessel against the rocky coastline. By the time the tempest passed, an estimated 300 ships lay destroyed at the bottom of the Aegean, along with 20,000 Persian soldiers and sailors. The scale of this disaster shocked the ancient world. This wasn't just bad weather, it was a geopolitical earthquake. The storm forced Persia to abandon its invasion plans completely, buying Greece nearly a decade to prepare for the next Persian attempt. Without this catastrophe, Greece might have fallen under Persian rule before classical Greek culture even had a chance to flourish. Consider the ripple effects: no golden age of Athens, no Parthenon, no foundation for Western philosophy, democracy, or drama as we know them. Herodotus, the father of history himself, called this storm an act of divine vengeance, writing that the gods punished Persian hubris for daring to bridge the Hellespont. Archaeological evidence confirms the historical accounts, with underwater surveys revealing Persian shipwrecks scattered around Mount Athos to this day. The storm became legendary in Greek memory, appearing in art and poetry for generations. When the Persians finally returned to Greece 8 years later, the Greeks were ready, and that preparation began with the lucky break of 492. A twist of weather didn't just save cities, it preserved an entire civilization at its most formative moment, proving how thin the line between historical triumph and oblivion can truly be. Now let us cross continents and centuries to witness how nature's fury twice reshaped Japan's destiny. In the late 13th century, Kublai Khan's Mongol Empire stood as the most formidable military force the world had ever seen, having conquered from China to Eastern Europe. Yet when his massive armada set sail for Japan in 1274, neither superior numbers nor fearsome siege weapons could withstand the forces of nature. The first invasion attempt saw nearly 900 ships carrying perhaps 40,000 warriors descend upon Japan's southern islands. After initial brutal fighting, just as the Mongols prepared to push inland, a monstrous typhoon struck without warning. Contemporary accounts describe how the storm's winds shattered entire fleets, drowning countless invaders and scattering their ships across the seafloor. The Japanese defenders, who had been barely holding their ground, suddenly found their enemies vanished beneath the waves, but this was only round one. 7 years later, in 1281, Kublai Khan launched an even more terrifying invasion force, possibly the largest seaborne assault in history until that point, with some sources claiming 4,000 ships and 140,000 troops. For 53 grueling days, Japanese samurai fought desperate holding actions along the coastlines of Kyushu as the Mongol juggernaut pressed forward. Then, on the eve of what might have been Japan's final stand, another devastating typhoon struck with uncanny timing. The Japanese called these storms Kamikaze, the divine wind, believing them to be sacred protection from the gods. The aftermath was staggering. Archaeological evidence from the seabed confirms thousands of smashed Mongol vessels off Japan's coast, with artifacts ranging from Chinese ceramics to shattered weapons still being recovered today. These twin typhoons didn't just save Japan militarily, they transformed the nation psychologically. The kamikaze became central to Japan's national identity, reinforcing the belief that the islands enjoyed divine protection. This cultural legacy would echo through centuries, even resurfacing during World War II with the infamous kamikaze pilots. Historically, the failed invasions changed East Asia's power balance. The enormous cost bankrupted the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China, hastening its eventual collapse. Meanwhile, Japan, spared foreign domination, developed its unique feudal culture largely undisturbed until the 16th century. Modern climate studies suggest these typhoons may have been part of a larger weather pattern, but for medieval Japan, they represented nothing less than the hand of heaven itself, two of history's most consequential strokes of luck that preserved an entire civilization at its most vulnerable moment. Turning our attention from the divine winds of Japan to the crumbling streets of ancient Rome, we encounter another astonishing twist of fate where disease played the unlikely hero. In the year 410, the once mighty Roman Empire found itself on the brink of collapse as Alaric I and his Visigoth armies surrounded the Eternal City, poised to deliver what many believed would be the final blow. The sack of Rome seemed inevitable until an invisible enemy changed everything. As the siege dragged into its second week, reports began circulating among the Visigoth ranks of soldiers falling violently ill. Contemporary accounts describe feverish men collapsing mid-battle, their bodies covered in dark pustules. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. Alaric, facing the prospect of his entire army being decimated by what historians now suspect was either smallpox or bubonic plague, made the startling decision to abandon the siege entirely. The Visigoths retreated northward, leaving Rome temporarily spared just when all seemed lost. What makes this outbreak particularly fascinating are the unanswered questions surrounding its origin. Some scholars argue the disease originated within Rome's overcrowded slums and spread to the besiegers through contaminated food or water. Others propose it was brought by the Visigoths themselves, who may have contracted it during earlier raids in the plague-ridden Balkans. A third theory suggests the Eastern Roman Empire deliberately introduced infected supplies into the siege lines, an early form of biological warfare. Grain shipments from Constantinople had arrived suspiciously close to the outbreak start, though no definitive proof exists. The plague's timing proved miraculous for Rome. Though the city would eventually fall to Alaric later that same year, the delay allowed critical reinforcements to arrive from Ravenna and gave Emperor Honorius precious months to shore up defenses elsewhere. More importantly, it prevented what could have been an even more devastating coordinated attack. Historians note that Alaric had been negotiating with Germanic tribes across the Rhine for a joint assault, that never materialized due to the disruption. Archaeological evidence adds layers to this story. Excavations of Visigoth camps near Rome show unusually high concentrations of hastily dug mass graves dating to this exact period, with skeletal remains bearing signs of violent death intermingled with those showing telltale bone lesions from infectious disease. Meanwhile, Roman medical texts from the era suddenly begin referencing the pestilence that felled our enemies in almost celebratory terms. This outbreak's legacy extended far beyond military outcomes. The temporary reprieve allowed Rome to evacuate many of its priceless ancient manuscripts to safer locations, preserving classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost during the later sacks. It also created a lasting superstition among invading forces about the dangers of besieging Rome, a hesitation that would resurface during Attila's campaigns decades later. In the grand tapestry of history, this forgotten plague reminds us that sometimes salvation comes not from swords or diplomacy, but from the unpredictable hand of nature itself. Even in its twilight years, fortune hadn't entirely abandoned the Eternal City. Just as disease turned the tide for Rome, the skies themselves seemed to take sides in ancient Greece during one of history's most desperate retreats. Picture this, the year 480 before the Common Era, and the Persian war machine under Xerxes I has just shattered the Greek defense at Thermopylae. Athens lies defenseless, its citizens scrambling to evacuate by sea as Persian forces close in. But in their darkest hour, an act of nature would rewrite their fate. As thousands of Athenians fled toward the coast, Persian cavalry units were mere hours away from cutting off their escape. Ancient sources like Herodotus describe a scene of chaos, families dragging belongings through dust-choked roads, the sick and elderly struggling to keep pace. Then, without warning, the heavens opened. A torrential downpour erupted, swelling stream beds into impassable barriers and transforming the Attic plains into a quagmire. Persian horsemen, weighed down by heavy armor, found their advance crippled by the mud, while the lighter Athenian refugees pressed on toward the waiting ships at Salamis. What makes this storm so extraordinary is how contemporaries interpreted it. The historian Diodorus Siculus records Athenian priests declaring the rainstorm a gift from Zeus himself, noting that it coincided with religious processions begging for deliverance. Modern meteorologists suggest it was likely a late summer Mediterranean cyclone, but to the Greeks, the timing felt supernatural. The storm didn't just slow the Persians, it raised morale among the fleeing populace, convincing them the gods still favored their cause despite recent defeats. The geopolitical consequences were immense. That extra day of grace allowed the Athenian navy to organize at Salamis, where they'd soon win the decisive battle that repelled Persian invasion. Without this delay, historians argue Xerxes might have captured or slaughtered the evacuated population, leaving Greece permanently under Persian dominion. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Sediment cores from the Attic region show an unusual layer of erosion dating to this exact period, consistent with catastrophic rainfall. Perhaps most fascinating is how this event shaped Greek identity. The divine rain became central to Athenian propaganda, depicted on pottery and invoked in plays for generations. It reinforced the idea that their civilization was under divine protection, a belief that fueled their later cultural golden age. Even today, scholars debate whether this meteorological miracle was pure chance or, as the ancients believed, something more mysterious at work. One thing's certain, when the survival of Western civilization hung by a thread, the weather itself seemed to take sides. Shifting our focus from divine storms to strategic gambles, let's examine how luck spared Rome from its most infamous nemesis, Hannibal. The year 216 before the Common Era marked a turning point in the Second Punic War. After annihilating a massive Roman army at Cannae, Hannibal stood just a few days' march from Rome itself. His victory was so complete that ancient historians claim he sent baskets of Roman senators' gold rings back to Carthage as proof of their devastation. Yet, inexplicably, he hesitated. The question that has baffled scholars for centuries is this: why didn't Hannibal strike the killing blow when Rome was at its weakest? One compelling theory lies in logistics. Though Hannibal's troops were battle-hardened, they were exhausted from years of campaigning across Italy. Marching on Rome would have required besieging a city of nearly 500,000 people, a daunting task without proper siege equipment. Contemporaries like Livy note that Hannibal's engineers lacked the tools to breach Rome's massive Servian walls, and his cavalry, though superb in open battle, would have been useless against fortifications. Worse still, his supply lines were stretched thin. The Romans had adopted a scorched earth strategy, denying him local resources. Without a reliable way to feed his army during a prolonged siege, Hannibal risked starvation before even reaching Rome's gates. Superstition may have also played a role. Hannibal, like many commanders of his era, relied heavily on omens. According to Polybius, his seers warned that the sacred chickens birds used for divination refused to eat before the march, a dire sign of divine disapproval. Some historians speculate Hannibal feared repeating his father's failed siege of a smaller Italian city years earlier, where superstitious dread had led to retreat. Whether these accounts are accurate or later Roman propaganda, they reveal how ancient leaders weighed supernatural signs alongside military logic. The consequences of this hesitation were monumental. By not capitalizing on Cannae, Hannibal allowed Rome to regroup. The Senate, displaying remarkable resilience, raised new legions from teenagers and freed slaves, a desperate move that paid off. Within a decade, Rome would counterattack Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal's recall and ultimate defeat at Zama. Modern archaeologists have found evidence of Rome's rapid recovery in coin hoards from this period, showing how quickly the Republic rebuilt its financial and military strength. What makes this moment so pivotal is the ripple effect it had on history. Had Hannibal marched, Western civilization might have developed under Carthaginian influence rather than Roman. Latin might never have become Europe's lingua franca, and concepts like republican government could have faded. Instead, Rome's survival allowed it to dominate the Mediterranean, shaping law, architecture, and culture for millennia. The next time you see a Roman aqueduct or hear a Romance language spoken, remember, it might all trace back to those critical weeks when luck, logistics, or perhaps even sacred chickens kept Hannibal just outside the gates. Turning from the battlefields of Italy to the scorching deserts of Egypt, we find another breathtaking twist of fate where nature itself intervened in human history. In the year 601 before the Common Era, the ambitious Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II set his sights on Egypt, aiming to crush Pharaoh Necho II and extend his empire's reach. Fresh from his conquest of Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar's army was a formidable force, hardened by years of warfare and backed by the wealth of Mesopotamia. Ancient records, including the biblical book of Jeremiah, describe how his troops marched confidently toward the Nile Delta, expecting an easy victory. But the desert had other plans. As the Babylonian forces advanced through the Sinai Peninsula, an unprecedented sandstorm engulfed them. Think of a wall of dust so thick it blotted out the sun, swallowing entire battalions in a matter of minutes. The storm raged for days, according to surviving accounts, burying weapons, scattering supply lines, and disorienting Nebuchadnezzar's seasoned soldiers. The Babylonian Chronicle, a key archaeological text, confirms the campaign's abrupt halt, noting that the king was forced to retreat by the will of the heavens. Modern meteorologists studying sediment layers in the region have identified evidence of an extreme weather event around this time, a layer of unusually dense sand deposits that align with the historical timeline. For Pharaoh Necho, this was nothing short of a miracle. Egypt had been weakened by its costly wars in the Levant, and its army was no match for Babylon's battle-hardened troops. The sandstorm bought Necho critical time to shore up his defenses, repairing border fortresses and rallying his forces. Archaeologists excavating sites near Pelusium, Egypt's eastern gateway, have uncovered hastily reinforced walls dating to this period, a clear sign of preparation for an invasion that never came. Nebuchadnezzar, meanwhile, turned his attention back to quelling rebellions in Judah, leaving Egypt untouched for another generation. The ripple effects of this event were profound. Had Babylon conquered Egypt, the balance of power in the ancient Near East would have shifted dramatically. Jerusalem might never have been destroyed in 586 before the Common Era, as Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have needed to retaliate against Judean revolts so harshly. Egypt's survival also allowed it to serve as a refuge for Jewish refugees fleeing Babylonian oppression, preserving cultural and religious traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Even the famous Rosetta Stone, discovered millennia later, owes its existence to this twist of fate. Without Necho's dynasty holding power, the Ptolemaic era that produced it might never have arisen. So the next time you feel annoyed by a windy day, remember, sometimes a bit of bad weather can change the course of civilizations. And as we'll see next, even the most advanced empires weren't immune to the whims of chance, especially when it came to the secrets of war. Shifting our gaze from the deserts of Egypt to the strategic waters around Constantinople, we encounter another moment where luck and technology collided to alter history. In the year 717 of the Common Era, the Byzantine Empire faced an existential threat as the Arab Umayyad Caliphate launched a massive naval assault on its capital. With a fleet of nearly 2,000 ships blockading the city, Constantinople's survival hung by a thread until a catastrophic mistake involving their most fearsome weapon, Greek fire, turned the tide. Greek fire was the ancient world's equivalent of a superweapon. A closely guarded state secret, this incendiary liquid could burn on water, stick to ships, and even ignite in midair when propelled through tubes or siphons. Its exact recipe remains lost to history, but historians speculate it involved a volatile mix of petroleum, quicklime, and sulfur, creating a napalm-like effect. The Byzantines had used it to devastating effect before, but this time it wasn't their skill that saved them. It was their enemies' incompetence. As the Arab fleet closed in on Constantinople's sea walls, they made a fatal error. Capturing several Byzantine ships equipped with Greek fire launchers, they attempted to turn the weapon against its creators. But without knowing the precise methods of ignition or delivery, their makeshift attack backfired spectacularly. Contemporary accounts describe panicked crews mishandling the siphons, accidentally setting their own ships ablaze. Flames spread rapidly through the tightly packed Arab fleet, creating a domino effect of destruction. The Byzantine chronicler Theophanes wrote that the fire leapt from vessel to vessel as if guided by divine wrath, leaving the waters choked with smoke and charred wreckage. The technological edge of Greek fire wasn't just in its composition but in its delivery system. Byzantine crews used pressurized bronze tubes, likely preheated to ensure ignition, with pumps to control the stream's intensity. Some scholars believe the mixture spontaneously combusted upon contact with water, making it even deadlier in naval combat. The Arabs, lacking this expertise, turned their greatest advantage into their downfall. This blunder had staggering consequences. The failed siege marked the beginning of the end for the Umayyad Caliphate's expansion into Europe. Within decades, internal strife and the rise of the Abbasids would divert their attention eastward, leaving Constantinople, and by extension Christian Europe, to flourish for another 7 centuries. Without this reversal, the Renaissance might never have had a Byzantine spark to ignite it. Even the survival of classics like Homer and Plato owed something to that day's chaotic flames. So while we often credit human ingenuity for shaping history, sometimes it's the mistakes, the dropped matches, the misread manuals that save civilizations. And speaking of close calls, our next story takes us to the high mountains of Greece, where an entire invasion force was stopped not by weapons but by the gods themselves, or so they believed. Now let's journey across the Atlantic to the heart of the Andes, where sheer coincidence and internal strife handed an empire to a handful of Spanish conquistadors. In 1532, the Inca Empire stood as the largest pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas, a mountain-spanning realm of unmatched wealth and sophistication. Yet, at the very moment Francisco Pizarro arrived with his tiny force of fewer than 200 men, the Incas were already crumbling from within, victims of a brutal civil war and invisible killers imported from Europe. The conflict between brothers Atahualpa and Huascar had torn the empire apart. After their father's death, the two heirs clashed over the throne, splitting loyalties among the Inca nobility. Atahualpa, commanding the northern armies based in Quito, eventually crushed Huascar's southern forces near Cusco in a series of bloody battles, but his victory came at a devastating cost. The war had drained the empire's manpower, disrupted its legendary road networks, and left regional governors distrustful of the new ruler. Worse, the fighting coincided with the spread of European diseases like smallpox, unintentional biological warfare that had raced ahead of Pizarro, killing thousands, including the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac and his chosen successor. When Pizarro marched into the highland town of Cajamarca, he found an empire already on its knees. Atahualpa, fresh from his Civil War triumph, underestimated the Spanish threat, believing his 30,000-strong entourage could overwhelm the foreigners. He didn't account for their steel weapons, firearms, or most crucially, their ruthlessness. The infamous ambush at Cajamarca, where Pizarro's men slaughtered thousands of unarmed Inca nobles and captured Atahualpa, was only possible because the empire's military was scattered and exhausted from infighting. Disease played an equally pivotal role. Smallpox had ravaged the Inca population for nearly a decade before Pizarro's arrival, killing an estimated 2/3 of the empire's people. Entire villages lay empty, agriculture collapsed, and the survivors were too weak to resist. The Spanish, immune after generations of exposure, exploited this devastation without even realizing it. What followed was a cascade of disasters. Atahualpa's ransom, a room filled with gold, only incentivized further Spanish invasions. His execution destabilized the empire further, and without a clear successor, regional factions fractured. The great Inca road system, designed to move armies swiftly, instead helped Spanish forces conquer the empire piecemeal. Within 40 years, a civilization that had stood for centuries was reduced to a puppet state. The tragic irony, had Pizarro arrived just 5 years earlier, he might have faced a united empire at full strength. Instead, luck handed him a fractured realm, its people decimated by invisible plagues and its leadership paralyzed by betrayal. It's a stark reminder that conquest often depends not just on swords, but on timing and sometimes on the unseen epidemics that march ahead of them. And speaking of invisible forces shaping history, our next tale takes us to the steppes of Central Asia, where a nomadic empire's survival hinged on a single, overlooked ambush. Now let's turn our attention to the Mediterranean, where a twist of fate altered the course of one of history's greatest rivalries. By 204 BC, the Second Punic War had raged for over a decade, with Hannibal's daring invasion of Italy bringing Rome to the brink of collapse. But the Carthaginian general's legendary victories, Cannae, Lake Trasimene, meant little without reinforcements. His brother Hasdrubal was marching from Spain with a fresh army, poised to strike the decisive blow. What unfolded next was a staggering stroke of bad luck for Carthage and a miraculous reprieve for Rome. Hasdrubal's campaign began with promise. After evading Roman forces in Spain, he crossed the Pyrenees and Alps, mirroring Hannibal's grueling route, but with one critical difference: winter came early. Unseasonable blizzards buried mountain passes, costing him thousands of men and precious time. Meanwhile, Rome's navy, often overshadowed by its legions, proved unexpectedly decisive. Patrols intercepted Carthaginian messengers, leaving Hasdrubal unaware of Hannibal's position. The brothers' plans to unite their armies dissolved into confusion. Then came the Meteorus River. Hasdrubal, desperate to link up with Hannibal in southern Italy, altered his route but was betrayed by local guides who led him straight into a Roman trap. Consuls Nero and Salinator, combining their forces in a daring night march, ambushed the Carthaginians at dawn. The battle was a slaughter. Hasdrubal's elephants panicked in the cramped terrain, trampling his own lines. When his severed head was later tossed into Hannibal's camp, the message was clear. Carthage's last hope had perished. The aftermath revealed how narrowly Rome had escaped disaster. Had Hasdrubal's messengers gotten through, or had the storms delayed the Romans by just a few days, the brothers might have merged their armies. Together, they could have besieged Rome itself. Instead, the war's momentum shifted irreversibly. With no reinforcements coming, Hannibal spent the next 4 years stranded in southern Italy, his veterans dwindling, while Rome regrouped and launched its fateful invasion of North Africa. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a collapse of timing and communication. The Carthaginians, masters of strategy, were undone by weather, mischance, and a single failed rendezvous. For Rome, it was salvation by sheer luck, a reminder that history often hinges not on brilliance, but on the storms that scatter the best-laid plans. And as we'll see next, even the mightiest empires could crumble when nature refused to cooperate, like the Babylonians, whose conquest of Egypt vanished into a whirlwind of sand. Now we journey across the ocean to the heart of Mesoamerica, where fate took the form of celestial omens and cultural misunderstandings. In 1519, as Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors landed on the shores of Mexico, the Aztec Empire stood at the height of its power, yet its ruler, Montezuma II, hesitated. What might seem like indecision was actually a cascade of misinterpreted warnings, a twist of luck that would seal the empire's downfall. Montezuma's priests had long been tracking strange signs in the heavens. A comet blazing across the night sky, unexplained fires in temples, and even reports of a two-headed bird. All were seen as harbingers of doom in Aztec cosmology. Ancient Mesoamerican beliefs held that such omens signaled the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who, according to legend, had vowed to reclaim his kingdom. When messengers brought news of pale-skinned strangers arriving on massive ships, Montezuma was paralyzed by dread. Were these men gods or invaders? His advisors debated, wasting precious weeks. The delay proved catastrophic. Cortés, far from divine, was a cunning opportunist. He exploited the Aztecs' hesitation, forging alliances with discontented tribes like the Tlaxcalans, who resented Tenochtitlan's dominance. By the time Montezuma realized his mistake, the Spanish had gained a foothold. Even then, cultural missteps piled up. Aztec warfare followed ritualized rules, prioritizing captive taking over slaughter, a stark contrast to the Spaniards' ruthless tactics. When Cortés staged a surprise massacre during the festival of Toxcatl, the Aztecs were unprepared for such treachery. Historians still debate whether Montezuma's reliance on omens was superstition or political calculation. Some suggest he feared provoking a potential deity, while others argue he underestimated the Spanish threat. Either way, the result was the same. The very beliefs that had sustained Aztec power became their Achilles' heel. Had Montezuma acted decisively upon first hearing of the Spaniards, he might have crushed Cortés' tiny force before it rallied allies. Instead, hesitation allowed the invaders to turn luck into conquest. This story isn't just about missed chances, it's about how cultural lenses shape history. The Aztecs read the cosmos for answers, while the Spanish saw only gold and glory. Their collision was less a battle of armies than a clash of worldviews, where chance and interpretation determined the victor. And as we'll soon see, even the mightiest empires could falter when nature itself seemed to conspire against them, like the Babylonians facing an unforgiving desert. Now we shift our gaze eastward, where the tides of luck turned not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of weary soldiers. In 326 BCE, Alexander the Great stood at the banks of the Hyphosis River in modern-day Pakistan. his eyes fixed on the vast unknown of India. His army, however, had reached its breaking point, a mutiny brewing not from cowardice but from sheer exhaustion. This single act of defiance would alter the fate of the Indian subcontinent, sparing the rising Mauryan Empire from the Macedonian war machine. Alexander's campaigns had stretched from Greece to the edges of the known world, but India proved a different beast altogether. The monsoons, unlike anything his troops had experienced, transformed the land into a waterlogged nightmare. Roads vanished beneath knee-deep mud, weapons rusted overnight, and dysentery ravaged the ranks. The locals spoke of even fiercer kingdoms ahead, rumors of war elephants numbering in the thousands, a force far beyond what Alexander's depleted cavalry could handle. The final straw came when his generals, led by Coenus, openly refused to advance. These were men who had crossed deserts and scaled mountains for him, yet even their loyalty had limits. Historians like Arrian describe the scene vividly. Alexander, famed for his persuasive speeches, retreated to his tent for 3 days, hoping his men would relent. But when he emerged to find their resolve unshaken, he made a rare concession. The decision to turn back was sealed not by enemy spears, but by the unbreakable spirit of his own army. What followed was a twist of historical irony. Had Alexander pressed onward, he would have collided with the nascent Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta, whose forces, though formidable, were still consolidating power. Instead, the Macedonian retreat allowed Chandragupta to expand unchallenged, forging an empire that would later stretch from Bengal to Afghanistan. Greek sources even suggest Chandragupta later traded 500 war elephants for a peace treaty with Alexander's successor, Seleucus, a deal that might never have happened if the Mauryans had faced the full might of Macedon at their weakest moment. This story isn't just about weather or mutiny. It's about the invisible limits of conquest, the point where even history's greatest generals must bow to circumstance. Alexander's luck had held through countless battles, but in India, it ran out not because the land defeated him, but because it eroded the will of those who followed him. And as we'll see next, even the most disciplined armies could find themselves at the mercy of nature's whims, like the Romans discovering too late that Germania's forests hid more than just warriors. Now let's turn to a desperate gamble that reshaped the fate of an empire, one where gold, not swords, became the weapon of salvation. In the sweltering summer of 626, Emperor Heraclius of Byzantium faced a nightmare scenario. The Avars, a fearsome nomadic confederation, had joined forces with Persia's Sassanid Empire to lay siege to Constantinople itself. The capital's mighty walls trembled under the weight of siege towers, while Persian armies choked supply lines across Anatolia. Yet Heraclius, a ruler as shrewd as he was beleaguered, spotted a flicker of hope in the Avars' loyalty, or rather, their lack of it. Here's what most accounts overlook. The Avars weren't ideological allies of Persia. They were mercenaries in all but name, drawn by the promise of loot and land. Heraclius, his treasury already drained by years of war, made a calculated bet. He sent envoys to the Avar Khagan with a chest of gold enough to dwarf the Persian bribes and a simple offer: leave now and take this wealth without spilling another drop of blood. Stay and risk losing everything when the tides turned. The timing was everything. Persian forces, stretched thin across 3 continents, were struggling to keep their siege engines supplied. Their ships, vital for blockading Constantinople's harbors, had been repeatedly ambushed by Byzantine patrols. Meanwhile, the Avars' own camp buzzed with discontent. Their cavalry, useless against the city's towering fortifications, grew restless as disease and hunger spread. The Khagan, weighing gold against glory, chose pragmatism. Within days, the Avars dismantled their camps and vanished northward, leaving the Persians stranded. But the real stroke of luck came from what happened next. Persian King Khosrow II, confident of victory, had diverted troops to sack Jerusalem, stripping his siege forces of critical reinforcements. When Heraclius launched a daring counterattack months later, he found the Persians unprepared and overextended. The result, a Byzantine resurgence that reclaimed lost territories and ultimately saved Eastern Christianity from collapse. This wasn't just bribery. It was strategic genius amplified by fortune's hand. Had the Avars refused the gold, or had Persian logistics not crumbled at that precise moment, Constantinople might have fallen, altering the course of Europe, the Middle East, and perhaps even the rise of Islam a few years later. Yet history, as we'll soon see, has a way of repeating these narrow escapes. Just ask the Vikings, whose next raid would be foiled by something as fickle as river tides. Now imagine a different kind of luck, one dictated not by gold, but by the relentless rhythm of nature itself. Fast forward to the year 885, when Paris stood as the jewel of the Frankish Empire, a prize irresistible to Viking raiders. Led by the fearsome chieftain Siegfried, a fleet of hundreds of longships descended upon the Seine, their dragon-proud vessels slicing through the water like knives. The Vikings, masters of river warfare, had sacked cities from York to Rouen with terrifying efficiency. Paris, with its wooden bridges and undefended monasteries, seemed destined to fall. But the Seine had other plans. The river's tides, unpredictable and powerful, began to rise far beyond normal levels as the Vikings anchored their ships near the city's vulnerable northern edge. Within hours, the rushing waters dislodged the longships from their moorings, slamming them into one another or stranding them on newly formed sandbanks. Viking warriors, accustomed to controlling the waves, now found themselves at the mercy of them. Supplies were ruined, weapons lost, and the meticulously planned assault dissolved into chaos. Here's where fortune smiled on Paris. The Frankish defenders, led by Count Odo, seized the moment. With the Vikings immobilized, Odo's forces rained down arrows and flaming projectiles from the city's fortified towers. The invaders, trapped between the river's wrath and Frankish steel, had no choice but to retreat temporarily. But the tides weren't done. When the Vikings regrouped and tried to reposition their fleet days later, the Seine's currents shifted again, this time dropping so low that their heavy ships became hopelessly grounded. The stalemate that followed was as much a product of luck as strategy. Siegfried, realizing his advantage had literally washed away, opted for negotiation over annihilation. In exchange for a massive payment of silver, 700 pounds of it, the Vikings agreed to spare Paris and sail onward. Yet this Danegeld was more than a bribe. It bought the Franks critical time to reinforce their defenses, ensuring that when the Vikings returned years later, Paris was ready. What makes this moment extraordinary isn't just the tide's intervention, but the ripple effect it created. Had the Seine behaved as usual, the Vikings might have shattered Frankish morale, emboldening further raids deeper into Europe. Instead, Paris survived to become a cornerstone of the emerging French kingdom. Sometimes history doesn't hinge on kings or armies, but on something as simple as water refusing to cooperate. And as we'll see next, even the mightiest conquerors could find themselves humbled by the whims of nature, like the Celts, who mistook a snowstorm for divine wrath at Delphi. Now, let's turn our attention to a moment where nature didn't just intervene, it seemed to send a message. In the year 279 before the Common Era, the Celtic tribes, fierce and unstoppable, swept down through the Balkan Peninsula with one goal: to plunder the riches of Delphi, the spiritual heart of ancient Greece. These warriors, known for their terrifying battle cries and unmatched ferocity, had already crushed armies and cities in their path. Delphi, with its legendary treasures and the sacred oracle, was the ultimate prize. The Greeks, weakened by infighting and unprepared for such an assault, seemed powerless to stop them. But Delphi wasn't just any city. It was the dwelling place of Apollo, the god of prophecy and light, and the Greeks believed fervently in his protection. As the Celts advanced, something extraordinary happened. A freak snowstorm blanketed the mountain passes in the middle of summer, an event so rare it felt like a miracle. The invaders, accustomed to the milder climates of Central Europe, found themselves shivering in unfamiliar cold. Then came the earthquakes, tremors so violent they sent boulders crashing down onto the Celtic camps. To the Celts, these weren't just natural disasters, they were signs. Apollo, they believed, was defending his sanctuary. The psychological impact was immediate. Celtic warriors, though fearless in battle, were deeply superstitious. The combination of snow, quakes, and the eerie reputation of Delphi's oracle shattered their confidence. Rumors spread that the gods themselves were fighting alongside the Greeks. Meanwhile, the defenders of Delphi, led by the Aetolian League, seized the moment. They launched guerrilla attacks under cover of the chaotic weather, picking off disoriented Celtic units one by one. The invaders, already demoralized, began to retreat in disarray. What makes this moment so fascinating isn't just the weather's role, it's how perception shaped history. Had the Celts pressed on, they might have overwhelmed Delphi's modest defenses. Instead, they interpreted natural events as divine intervention, a twist of luck that saved Hellenistic Greece from devastation. Delphi's survival preserved not just its treasures, but the cultural and religious unity of the Greek world at a critical time. The Celts' missed opportunity allowed Greek influence to endure, shaping the Mediterranean for centuries to come. And as we'll see next, even the most disciplined armies could find their plans undone by forces beyond their control, like the Roman legions, who faced a very different kind of reckoning in the forests of Germania. Now let's journey eastward along the ancient Silk Road, where a single missed opportunity reshaped the destiny of Central Asia. In the year 1141 of the Common Era, the mighty Seljuk Empire, rulers of Persia and beyond, stood on the brink of crushing a nomadic force that history would later recognize as the Kara Khitan. The Seljuks, masters of cavalry warfare and seasoned conquerors, had every advantage: superior numbers, disciplined troops, and the element of surprise. They'd tracked the Kara Khitan army to the banks of the Katun steppe, a perfect spot for an ambush. Victory here would have cemented Seljuk dominance over the Silk Road's lucrative trade routes. But fate had other plans, for reasons still debated by historians, perhaps overconfidence, faulty intelligence, or sheer hesitation. The Seljuks never struck. It was a pause that cost them everything. The Kara Khitan, a confederation of displaced Khitan tribes and nomadic allies, were already battle-hardened survivors. Led by the cunning Yaludashi, they'd fled the collapse of their homeland in northern China, forging a new identity on the move. When the Seljuks failed to attack, Yaludashi didn't just escape, he turned the tables. Within months, his forces rallied local Turkic tribes disillusioned with Seljuk rule, and at the Battle of Katun, they delivered a staggering blow. The Seljuks, caught off guard by the very army they'd spared, were routed. The ripple effects were astonishing. The Kara Khitan, against all odds, carved out the Western Lyro Empire, a realm stretching from the Aral Sea to the borders of China. Their rule wasn't just a military conquest, it was a cultural bridge. Unlike the Seljuks, who'd imposed rigid Islamic governance, the Kara Khitan tolerated diverse religions, from Buddhism to Nestorian Christianity, fostering a rare era of coexistence along the Silk Road. Trade flourished as merchants moved freely under their protection, and cities like Samarkand thrived as melting pots of ideas. What's truly striking is how one decision or indecision altered the region's trajectory. Had the Seljuks attacked when they had the chance, Central Asia might have remained under their centralized control, potentially stifling the cultural exchanges that defined the era. Instead, the Kara Khitan's dominance created a buffer between the Islamic world and China, influencing everything from Mongol tactics to the spread of technologies like papermaking. Their legacy even echoes in the name Cathay, an old European term for China derived from Khitan. As we'll see next, nature could be just as unpredictable as human hesitation, like the brutal winter that halted Rome's revenge in Germania. But for now, consider this: sometimes history's greatest twists come not from battles fought, but from those avoided. Now, shifting our focus to the dense forests of ancient Germania, we encounter a moment where nature itself became the ultimate defender against one of history's most formidable empires. In the year 9 of the Common Era, the Roman legions suffered one of their most humiliating defeats at the hands of Arminius, a Germanic chieftain who had once served Rome. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. 3 entire legions were ambushed and annihilated, a loss so devastating that Emperor Augustus reportedly cried out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." But Rome's humiliation didn't end there. Determined to avenge this catastrophic defeat, the Romans launched punitive campaigns into Germania in the years that followed. Led by generals like Germanicus, these expeditions were meant to reclaim lost prestige and pacify the region, and for a time they seemed unstoppable. Germanicus' forces won several battles, even recovering the lost legionary eagles, a symbolic victory. Yet just as Rome appeared poised to crush Germania once and for all, an unexpected ally intervened: winter. The forests of Germania were unforgiving even in mild seasons, but the winter of 15 and 16 of the Common Era was exceptionally brutal. Blizzards buried supply lines, freezing temperatures crippled marching legions, and starvation gnawed at discipline. Roman soldiers, trained for Mediterranean climates, found themselves hopelessly outmatched by the elements. One account describes troops so desperate they resorted to eating their pack animals. The Germanic tribes, meanwhile, knew the land intimately. They used the weather as a weapon, launching hit-and-run attacks against isolated Roman units before vanishing into the snow. Ultimately, Emperor Tiberius called off the campaigns, realizing the cost outweighed any potential gains. This decision had profound consequences. Rome never fully subdued Germania, leaving it a volatile frontier that would later unleash waves of migrations and invasions, contributing to the empire's eventual decline. Meanwhile, Arminius, once a Roman auxiliary, became a legendary figure among Germanic tribes, symbolizing resistance against imperial domination. His victory, sealed by nature's intervention, ensured Germania remained a land beyond Rome's grasp. What's fascinating is how this harsh winter didn't just save Germania, it reshaped Europe's destiny. Had Rome succeeded, Latin culture might have spread far deeper into the continent. Instead, the Germanic tribes preserved their distinct identity, laying the groundwork for medieval kingdoms that would one day emerge from those very forests. As we'll soon see, luck could wear many faces, sometimes a storm, sometimes a disease. Next, we'll witness how a slave revolt unexpectedly became the Mongols' greatest obstacle. But for now, remember this: even empires that conquer armies can be humbled by the skies above. Now, let's journey from the frozen forests of Germania to the sun-scorched battlefields of the Middle East, where an empire of slaves turned the tide against the seemingly unstoppable Mongol horde. In the year 1260, the Mongol Empire was at its terrifying peak, having crushed every army in its path from China to Hungary. Their reputation was so fearsome that many cities surrendered without a fight, knowing resistance meant annihilation. But in a twist of fate, it wasn't a grand empire or a seasoned army that stopped them. It was a group of former slaves, the Mamluks, whose own internal chaos ironically placed them in the perfect position to make history. The Mamluks were a unique force. Originally enslaved as children, primarily from the steppes of Central Asia, they were trained as elite warriors by the Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt. Through skill and sheer grit, they rose to power, eventually overthrowing their own masters in a coup. But their newfound rule was shaky. Rival factions vied for control, and the Mongols, fresh from sacking Baghdad, were closing in on Syria. The Islamic world trembled, expecting the worst. Then came a stroke of luck wrapped in betrayal. The Mongol leader, Hulagu Khan, had to abruptly withdraw most of his forces after receiving news of the Great Khan's death, leaving behind only a smaller contingent under General Kitbuka. Sensing opportunity, the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general Baybars rallied their fractured factions with a unifying call: defend Islam or face extinction. Even more fortuitous, the Mongols had just executed the last Ayyubid prince, removing a potential rival and giving the Mamluks uncontested legitimacy as defenders of the faith. The two armies clashed at Ain Jalut in modern-day Israel. The Mamluks used terrain to their advantage, luring the Mongols into a narrow valley where their famed cavalry mobility was stifled. Baybars, a former slave who'd once been sold in Damascus, led feigned retreats that broke Mongol formations, while Mamluk archers rained death from the flanks. In a brutal climax, Kitbuka was captured and executed, marking the first time a Mongol army had been decisively defeated in open battle. The ripple effects were monumental. The Mamluks didn't just save Egypt, they preserved the heartlands of Islam from devastation, allowing cities like Cairo and Damascus to flourish as centers of culture and learning. Meanwhile, the Mongols' aura of invincibility shattered, emboldening others to resist. Curiously, the Mamluks' own origins as outsiders became their strength. Having grown up on the steppes like their enemies, they understood Mongol tactics intimately, turning the empire's weapon, its terrifying cavalry, against itself. What makes Ain Jalut so remarkable isn't just the battle itself, but the chain of lucky breaks that made it possible. Hulagu's departure, the Mamluk coup's timing, even the execution of a rival prince. Had any link in that chain broken differently, the Mongols might have surged into Africa, rewriting the map of the medieval world. Instead, the Mamluks, a band of slave soldiers, became the unexpected bulwark that changed history. As we'll see next, luck sometimes wears the mask of disaster, like the volcanic ash that shielded Korea from invasion. But for now, remember this: even the mightiest conquerors can be undone by the very systems they underestimate. Shifting our focus from the deserts of the Middle East to the sun-baked banks of the Nile, we arrive at one of history's most mysterious catastrophes, the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1177 before Common Era, the Mediterranean world was plunged into chaos. Entire civilizations, the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and even mighty city-states like Ugarit, crumbled beneath waves of invaders known only as the Sea Peoples. Cities burned, trade routes vanished, and writing systems were forgotten. Yet amid this apocalyptic upheaval, one kingdom stood firm: Egypt. How did it survive when others fell? The answer lies in a combination of shrewd leadership, geographic luck, and a pharaoh who saw the storm coming. Egypt's resilience began with Pharaoh Ramses III, often called the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. Unlike his neighbors, Ramses didn't dismiss the early raids as isolated incidents. He recognized the Sea Peoples as an existential threat and acted decisively. First, he reformed Egypt's military, incorporating captured Sea Peoples warriors as mercenaries, turning the enemy's strength against them. Next, he fortified the Nile Delta, constructing a network of coastal defenses that funneled invaders into choke points where Egyptian archers and chariots could pick them off. But perhaps his most ingenious move was economic. He stockpiled grain during plentiful harvests, ensuring Egypt wouldn't starve when trade collapsed. Geography played an equally vital role. The Nile was both a shield and a sword. Its predictable floods kept farmlands fertile even as drought crippled other regions, and its marshy delta acted as a natural barrier, forcing the Sea People's ships into narrow channels where they became easy targets. Meanwhile, deserts to the east and west deterred land invasions. Compare this to the Hittites, whose heartland in Anatolia was overrun because it lacked defensible borders. Egypt's isolation, once seen as a weakness, became its salvation. The climax came in two epic battles recorded in vivid detail on the walls of Ramses' mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. In the first, the Egyptian navy ambushed the Sea People's fleet at the mouth of the Nile, using grappling hooks to capsize ships and arrows to pick off swimmers. The second battle was a land clash where Ramses' forces herded the invaders into a killing zone, annihilating them. These victories weren't just military triumphs. they were psychological blows that convinced the sea peoples to bypass Egypt entirely, targeting softer prey elsewhere. Yet survival came at a cost. The wars drained Egypt's treasury, and the collapse of international trade left it impoverished. Within decades, internal strife and corruption would end the new kingdom's golden age. Still, Ramses' legacy is undeniable. By combining foresight, flexibility, and a stroke of geographic fortune, he spared Egypt the fate of its contemporaries. Imagine how different history might be if the Nile's treasures, its art, architecture, and knowledge had been lost like the Hittites' libraries or the Mycenaeans' palaces. As we'll soon see, luck sometimes takes the form of celestial omens like the eclipse that terrified invaders of Byzantium. But for now, consider this: in a world collapsing around it, Egypt endured not just by the will of its pharaohs, but by the timeless advantages of its lifeline, the Nile. Now, from the Nile's enduring resilience, we journey to the heart of the Byzantine Empire, where the heavens themselves seem to intervene in a moment of desperate need. In the year 513, the Bulgars, a fierce nomadic people, were pressing hard against Constantinople's borders. Emperor Anastasius had already weathered years of their raids, but this invasion threatened to overwhelm his defenses. Then, as if answering an unspoken plea, the sky darkened in the middle of the day. A total solar eclipse plunged the battlefield into eerie twilight, and what happened next was nothing short of miraculous. The Bulgars, like many ancient cultures, saw eclipses as cosmic omens. To them, the sun's sudden disappearance wasn't just unusual, it was a divine warning. Procopius, the era's most meticulous historian, recorded how their warriors froze in terror, interpreting the eclipse as a sign of their god's wrath. Horses reared, battle cries turned to panicked whispers, and within hours the entire Bulgar army was in retreat. For Emperor Anastasius, it was an inexplicable stroke of luck. His outnumbered forces, moments from collapse, found themselves victorious without lifting another sword. But why were eclipses so universally feared? Across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, cultures wove myths around these celestial events. The Chinese believed a celestial dragon devoured the sun, while Norse legends spoke of wolves chasing it across the sky. The Byzantines themselves inherited Greek superstitions, viewing eclipses as portents of disaster often tied to the fall of kings or empires. In this case, the Bulgars' own traditions magnified their terror. Their shamans likely interpreted the eclipse as a direct rejection of their campaign, urging immediate withdrawal to avoid divine punishment. The aftermath reshaped the region's politics. Anastasius, seizing the moment, reinforced his frontier defenses, ensuring the Bulgars wouldn't return soon. Meanwhile, the event entered Byzantine law as proof of divine favor, bolstering the empire's prestige. Modern historians, however, see a fascinating collision of science and superstition. We now know the eclipse of 513 was part of a predictable celestial cycle, but for those on the ground it felt like the hand of fate. Contrast this with the later eclipse of 585, which the Byzantines themselves misinterpreted as a bad omen during war with Persia. Luck, it seems, depended entirely on perspective. For the Bulgars, the sky's sudden darkness was a command to flee. For Anastasius, it was deliverance. And for us, a reminder that history's turning points often hinge on moments as fragile as a shadow passing over the sun. Next, we'll see how another empire, this time in the Far East, used timing and terrain to defy the odds against a relentless foe. But for now, consider how easily the Bulgars' invasion might have succeeded if not for a quirk of celestial mechanics and the primal fear it ignited. The line between conquest and collapse, it seems, was written in the stars. Leaving the shadow of Byzantine eclipses behind, we turn eastward to the windswept steppes of ancient China, where the Han dynasty faced its own moment of improbable salvation. In the year 89, the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic warriors who had terrorized China's borders for centuries, were poised to strike a decisive blow. Their raids had grown bolder, and the Han Empire, already strained by internal strife, seemed vulnerable. General Du Xian, tasked with defending the northern frontier, knew his forces were outmatched. But then, fate intervened in the most unexpected way. The Xiongnu, notorious for their lightning-fast cavalry attacks, inexplicably delayed their assault. Historians still debate the reasons for this hesitation. Some point to internal divisions among the Xiongnu clans, while others suggest harsh weather disrupted their movements. Whatever the cause, that delay gave Du Xian a precious gift: time. He used it to rally scattered troops, fortify key positions, and even secure reinforcements from reluctant regional governors. By the time the Xiongnu finally advanced, the Han army was no longer a disorganized defense force but a coordinated strike group. The battle that followed was a masterclass in tactical adaptation. Du Xian, recognizing his enemy's reliance on mobility, lured the Xiongnu into a narrow valley where their horses lost their advantage. Han crossbowmen, hidden on the cliffs above, rained down volleys of arrows while infantry sealed the exits. The Xiongnu, trapped and outmaneuvered, suffered devastating losses. It was a victory so complete that it temporarily shattered their power, pushing them back into the steppes and securing China's borders for years. What makes this moment remarkable isn't just the military brilliance, it's the chain of near misses that made it possible. Had the Xiongnu attacked even a week earlier, Du Xian's reinforcements wouldn't have arrived. Had their scouts discovered the Han preparations, they might have avoided the trap altogether. Instead, a mix of luck and leadership turned the tide. The aftermath reshaped East Asia. The Xiongnu's decline created a power vacuum that eventually gave rise to new nomadic empires, while the Han dynasty bought itself a critical breathing space. Yet it's worth noting how close it all came to disaster. One less day of delay, one missed opportunity to regroup, and the map of Asia might look very different today. This pattern of narrow escapes continues as we journey further east, where geography itself would become an unlikely ally against invasion. But for now, consider how history often hinges not just on great leaders or superior weapons, but on the fragile, fleeting moments when time itself seems to pause, just long enough to change everything. Now, as we sail into the turbulent waters of the Mediterranean, we find Venice, a city built on canals and commerce facing its darkest hour. The year is 1500, and the Ottoman Empire, at the height of its naval power, has set its sights on crushing the Venetian Republic. With a massive fleet of over 200 ships, the Ottomans plan to strike Venice at its heart, aiming to dominate the trade routes that made the city fabulously wealthy. The stage was set for a clash that could reshape the balance of power in Europe, but then nature intervened with brutal force. As the Ottoman Armada navigated the Adriatic Sea, a violent storm erupted without warning. The waters, usually calm in late summer, turned into a churning nightmare. Ships that had once seemed invincible were tossed like toys in the tempest. Mast after mast snapped under the wind's fury, and waves swallowed entire galleys whole. Within hours, the storm had obliterated nearly half the Ottoman fleet, scattering the rest in disarray. This wasn't just bad weather, it was a disaster with geopolitical consequences. Venice, which had been bracing for an inevitable siege, suddenly found itself reprieved. The Ottomans, forced to retreat and rebuild, lost their momentum. The storm bought Venice precious time to reinforce its defenses and rally allies. More importantly, it disrupted Ottoman plans to control the Adriatic, a strategic lifeline for European trade. Had the fleet arrived intact, Venice might have fallen, shifting Mediterranean dominance decisively to the Ottomans. Historians often debate whether Venice's survival was pure luck or something more. Some point to the city's legendary naval engineers, who designed ships capable of weathering rough seas unlike the heavier Ottoman galleys. Others argue that local fishermen, attuned to the Adriatic's moods, might have warned Venetian commanders of the impending storm. But what's undeniable is the storm's role as a turning point. Venice's reprieve allowed it to maintain its influence for another century, shaping everything from Renaissance art to global finance. The aftermath rippled far beyond the Adriatic. With the Ottoman threat delayed, other European powers like Spain and the Holy Roman Empire gained time to organize against future invasions. The storm also exposed Ottoman vulnerabilities at sea, prompting them to rethink their naval strategies. For Venice, it was a reminder of how fragile its maritime empire truly was, a lesson that would echo in later conflicts. What makes this moment extraordinary is how fleeting the window of opportunity was. Had the storm arrived a day later, the Ottoman fleet might have reached Venetian shores. Had it been less severe, the damage might not have been decisive. Instead, a few hours of chaos at sea altered the course of history, proving once again that even the mightiest empires are at the mercy of the elements. As we leave the Adriatic behind, our next stop takes us to a different kind of upheaval, one where the earth itself would shake the foundations of a Spartan war machine. But for now, consider how a single storm didn't just save Venice. It preserved the fragile web of alliances that defined Renaissance Europe. Luck, it seems, doesn't just favor the prepared, it favors those who survive long enough to tell the tale. Now, shifting our gaze from the storm-lashed Adriatic to the rugged hills of ancient Greece, we uncover a moment when the very ground beneath Sparta's feet betrayed them. The year was 464 before Common Era, and tensions between Sparta and Athens were reaching a boiling point. Sparta, the militaristic powerhouse of the Peloponnese, had long viewed Athens' growing influence with suspicion. War seemed inevitable until the earth itself intervened in a way no army could anticipate. One summer night, without warning, a massive earthquake struck Sparta. The tremor was so violent that it reduced much of the city to rubble. Ancient historians like Thucydides describe entire barracks collapsing, burying Spartan soldiers, the backbone of their society, under tons of stone. Thousands perished in an instant, including young men in training, crippling Sparta's military strength. But the disaster didn't end there. The quake triggered a revolt by the Helots, the enslaved population Sparta relied on for labor. Seizing the chaos, they launched a brutal uprising, forcing Sparta to divert its remaining forces to suppress them. This twist of fate had profound consequences. The earthquake delayed Sparta's planned campaign against Athens by years, buying the Athenians critical time to strengthen their alliances and expand their own influence. By the time Sparta recovered, the balance of power in Greece had shifted. Athens, untouched by the disaster, had forged the Delian League, a coalition of city-states that would become the foundation of its naval empire. Had the quake not struck, Sparta might have crushed Athens before it could rally its allies, altering the trajectory of Greek history. What makes this event so remarkable is how it exposes the fragility of even the most disciplined societies. Sparta prided itself on invincibility, yet a few minutes of geological chaos brought it to its knees. The quake also revealed Sparta's Achilles heel, its dependence on the Helots. The revolt drained Sparta's resources and morale, forcing it to seek help from rivals like Athens, a humbling admission of weakness that sowed seeds of future conflict. Historians still debate whether the earthquake was purely bad luck for Sparta or a stroke of fortune for Greece. Some argue that the delay prevented an earlier, even bloodier Peloponnesian War. Others suggest it merely postponed the inevitable. But one thing is clear, the quake reshaped alliances in ways no diplomat could have predicted. Sparta's desperation led to uneasy truces and unexpected partnerships, while Athens' rise set the stage for its golden age. As dust settled over Sparta, the political landscape of Greece had been rewritten not by swords or speeches, but by the capricious forces of nature. It's a stark reminder that even the mightiest warriors are no match for the planet's raw power. And with Sparta temporarily sidelined, our next story takes us to the Nile, where another civilization would be spared by nature's unpredictability, this time through a flood of biblical proportions. Leaving behind the fractured landscape of Sparta, we journey to the sun-baked banks of the Nile, where the river itself would become an unlikely savior. In the year 170 before Common Era, the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt found itself under siege by Antiochus IV, the ambitious Seleucid ruler who sought to expand his empire southward. His campaign had been devastatingly effective until the Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, intervened in a way no strategist could have foreseen. That year, the annual flood arrived with unprecedented force. Normally, Egyptians celebrated the inundation as it deposited fertile silt across their fields, but this time the waters surged beyond their banks, swallowing roads, drowning camps, and cutting off supply lines. Antiochus' army, camped near the delta, found themselves stranded, their wagons bogged down in the mud, their grain stores spoiled, and disease spread rapidly among the waterlogged troops. Ancient accounts describe soldiers waist-deep in floodwaters, their weapons useless against the rising tide. The Seleucid siege engines meant to breach Egyptian fortifications became waterlogged ruins. For the Ptolemaic rulers, this was a divine reprieve. The flood bought them critical time to rally their defenses and secure alliances. Meanwhile, Antiochus' starving troops grew desperate. With no way to forage or receive reinforcements, his campaign crumbled as swiftly as the riverbanks. Within weeks, the Seleucid forces were forced into a humiliating retreat, their dreams of conquest washed away by the Nile's fury. What makes this event extraordinary is how it underscores the Nile's dual role as both nurturer and destroyer. For centuries, Egyptians had built their civilization around the river's predictable rhythms, but this flood defied all expectations. Some historians speculate that unusual rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands triggered the disaster, while others point to possible shifts in climate patterns. Either way, the deluge exposed the fragility of even the most disciplined armies when faced with nature's whims. The aftermath reshaped the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt, spared from conquest, retained its independence for another century, while Antiochus returned to Syria weakened and discredited. His failure emboldened rebellions across his empire, proving that luck, whether divine or environmental, could alter the fate of nations as decisively as any battle. Yet the Nile's intervention wasn't just about water levels. It revealed a deeper truth. Geography could be as formidable as any army. The river, long Egypt's protector, had once again proven its loyalty. And as the floodwaters receded, they left behind not just fertile soil, but a lesson in humility, for even the mightiest conquerors could drown in the tides of chance. Now let's turn our attention northward, where another empire would owe its survival to an even stranger twist of fate, a shipment of grain that arrived just in time to stave off collapse. As the Nile's floods recede from our story, we find ourselves stepping into the arid highlands of Anatolia, where another civilization teetered on the brink of disaster. The year is 1250 before Common Era, and the mighty Hittite Empire, once the dominant power of the Bronze Age Near East, faces a crisis that no army can defeat. Drought has gripped their lands for years, withering crops and emptying granaries. Famine spreads like a shadow across their cities, and whispers of rebellion stir among their vassals. In this desperate hour, salvation arrives not from the gods, but from an unlikely source, their longtime rivals, the Egyptians. The relationship between Hittites and Egyptians had been defined by war for generations. Just decades earlier, they clashed in the legendary Battle of Kadesh, where chariots thundered across the plains in one of history's largest Bronze Age conflicts. Yet now, Pharaoh Merneptah dispatches a fleet laden with grain up the eastern Mediterranean coast. Why would Egypt aid its enemy? Ancient correspondence reveals a pragmatic calculus. A collapsing Hittite empire would send shockwaves through the region, destabilizing trade routes and unleashing refugee waves. The shipment, documented in cuneiform tablets pleading for life-giving barley, was as much self-preservation as diplomacy. When the Egyptian ships docked at Ugarit, the scale of the relief effort stunned Hittite officials. One tablet describes 300 measures of emmer wheat unloading at the docks, enough to feed thousands. This wasn't charity, it was a geopolitical lifeline. The grain bought the Hittites precious months to redistribute resources, suppress unrest, and negotiate with other drought-stricken neighbors. Modern climate studies of sediment cores confirm this period saw catastrophic aridity. Without this intervention, Hattus's storied gates might have fallen far sooner. But the deeper irony lies in what followed. This act of cooperation between ancient superpowers created a fleeting détente, culminating in the marriage of a Hittite princess to Ramses II. The famed Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, considered history's first recorded international accord, owed its existence to that desperate grain shipment. For a brief moment, survival trumped rivalry, yet luck, as always, proved fickle. Within 50 years, the Hittite Empire would vanish amid the Bronze Age collapse, consumed by invasions, climate shifts, and internal fractures. But that grain shipment bought them and the entire Eastern Mediterranean critical respite. It's a reminder that in history's darkest hours, even enemies can become unlikely saviors. And as we'll see next, nature's mercy could take even more astonishing forms, like the volcanic ash that would one day shield Korea from annihilation. Now, as we journey from the drought-stricken plains of Anatolia to the turbulent waters of East Asia, another twist of fate emerges, one written not in grain shipments but in volcanic fury. The year is 1592, and Japan's ambitious warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi has set his sights on conquering Korea as a stepping stone to invade Ming China. His armada, one of the largest in pre-modern history, boasts hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers. For Korea's Joseon dynasty, the threat is existential. But in a twist no strategist could predict, salvation would come from an eruption 800 kilometers away, Mount Fuji's violent awakening. As Hideyoshi's fleet crossed the Korea Strait, Fuji's eruption blanketed the skies with ash far beyond Japan's borders. Contemporary Korean records describe eerie, sunless days where the air thickened like twilight, reducing visibility to mere paces. For navigators reliant on celestial cues, this was catastrophic. Ships strayed off course, collided with unseen reefs, or simply drifted aimlessly. The ash also fouled freshwater supplies and clogged rice stores, accelerating misery among the invasion force. Hideyoshi's meticulously planned logistics, critical for supplying troops across the sea, collapsed into chaos. The disruption bought Korea's navy, led by the legendary Admiral Yi Sun-sin, precious time to regroup. Yi's famous turtle ships, armored and bristling with cannons, had already scored early victories. But without the ash-induced delays, Hideyoshi's reinforcements might have overwhelmed them. Modern volcanologists studying ice cores have traced sulfur deposits from Fuji's 1592 eruption as far as Greenland, confirming its hemispheric impact. For Korea, this atmospheric interference was nothing short of providence, yet the ash's protection extended beyond navigation woes. When Japanese troops finally landed, they found Korean farmers had harvested crops early. A decision informed by the abnormal darkening of the skies, which they interpreted as an omen. This accidental scorched earth tactic left Hideyoshi's army starving, while Korean guerrillas exploited the disarray. The invasion, meant to be swift, dragged into a grinding 6-year war that ultimately failed. Historians debate whether Fuji's eruption alone altered the war's outcome. But like the Hittite grain shipment, it underscores how fragile conquest is against nature's whims. Hideyoshi, a man who believed his destiny was to rule Asia, found his ambitions buried under volcanic ash. And so, as our journey through history's narrow escapes concludes, we're left to wonder how many empires owe their survival not to generals or gods, but to the unpredictable mercy of luck itself. And so we reach the end of our journey through history's most improbable moments where storms, plagues, and even volcanoes bent the fate of nations. 25 times the thread of survival hung by chance. Imagine a world where Persia's fleet hadn't shattered against Mount Athos, where the Kamikaze winds never rose to repel the Mongols, or where Alaric's Visigoths stormed a plague-weakened Rome. Would Greece's golden age have been smothered before Socrates ever questioned the world? Would Japan's samurai culture have vanished under Kublai Khan's boot? Might the Roman Empire have collapsed centuries earlier, altering the very foundations of Europe? These aren't just footnotes, they're hinges that swung entire civilizations toward glory or ruin. Think of Admiral Yi's turtle ships, victorious only because volcanic ash blinded his enemies. Or Ramses III, whose last-minute reforms barely held Egypt together as the Bronze Age crumbled around him. Even the mighty Mongols, conquerors of continents, met their match not in armies, but in typhoons and Mamluk slave soldiers who stumbled into history's spotlight by sheer accident. What's astonishing isn't just that these events happened, it's how easily they might not have. A single day's shift in the wind, a messenger's delayed journey, or a general's superstitious hesitation rewrote maps and destinies. Luck, it seems, is the silent architect of our world. So tell us which of these narrow escapes leaves you most in awe. Was it the sandstorm that saved Egypt from Nebuchadnezzar's wrath, or the rainstorm that let Athens escape Xerxes' grasp? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed this dive into history's razor-thin margins, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because who knows, the next twist of fate we explore might just reshape how you see the past and the fragile threads holding our present together.